Undertale is objectively the most important game in my life. It opened so many doors for me that were previously closed and changed the entire trajectory of my life in a way that no other piece of media ever has. And honestly, I don't think ever will. This silly indie game shaped my childhood from whenever I first got into it in 2016 all the way up to now, 10 years later. It has been so unbelievably formative to me in a way that I don't think I could ever explain. And for any subscribers who have been around for a while, you probably know that I've tried. I have a now unlisted video that I made last year, a week before the 10th anniversary of Undertale, where I attempted to show how important the game was to me. But for reasons I'm not particularly comfortable with sharing, I privated that video. And now I'm at a point in life where I don't feel the need to justify the significance of this game ever, really. I know how it's impacted me, and if one day I feel the need to talk in depth about that, I will. But getting back on track, this was a video I've been wanting to make for a long time. Chara Dreemurr has been my favorite Undertale character for years, but I always found it to be difficult to fully encapsulate why. There's a lot of mystique going on behind them and how they exactly contribute to not only the story of Undertale, but also the themes the game represents. And while I've been in the process of putting together part 2 of my Has-Been Hotel review, I've been replaying Undertale to give myself a sort of break. Making these videos can be very taxing after all. And while I was replaying it, I had some interesting thoughts about how I perceived the game's story through the lens of 2026. The last time I had really sat down and reanalyzed the entire story, I was significantly younger. I'm 19 now. This makes me much more confident that I can better understand some of these characters, and specifically Chara, the first fallen human. So I wanted to dedicate this somewhat shorter video, at least in comparison to my last two, to discussing some of the nuances behind them and answering a big question that seems to bring a lot of discourse within the Undertale community. Was Chara Dreemurr a bad person? Well, the rest of this video will be going over my take and an overall analysis of their character. It's mostly an analysis that later answers the question posed in the title. I hope you're okay with that. So strap in, subscribe if you're feeling generous, and enjoy my ramble. Dislike it if you want me to die, and let's get started. Chara Dreemurr is said to be the first fallen human in the underground and can be seen from literally the first cutscene in the game. There's a very great chance you already know, but within the opening cinematic of Undertale, this human who falls into the mountain is not actually the character you play as. This can be seen from the number of stripes on their shirts being inconsistent, but also from the very end of the True Pacifist row extending the opening. According to Azrael, who is Chara's best friend and adopted brother, Chara climbed the mountain for a quote, unhappy reason. The line is left intentionally vague enough for us to come to our own conclusions, some of those darker than others. But to create a list of motivations, let's first give some more context about who they actually are. Azrael stated that Chara hated humanity. This can be shown point blank when they wanted to kill all the humans in their village whilst having partial possession of Azrael's body. The exact reasons for their hatred are unknown, but it could potentially be connected to the humans sealing away monster kind under Mount Ebott. Perhaps this is why their venture up the mountain was preceded by that story, to in retrospect explain their motivations for abandoning humanity and maybe in a certain route abandoning their humanity. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Chara is also known to be relatively smart. Their choice in vocabulary, their logistical actions, and their specific readings of the players all showed them to be, for their age, a decently intelligent child. Yes, Undertale artists, a child. Chara is a child. Let's not forget that. But the point is, they think very critically. They're all about efficiency. Look no further than the alarm clock dialogue or their opinions when you replay a genocide run, reaching a point where they can't understand the motive behind it. After all, what is the purpose when you can just go destroy another world? This line actually stands out to me a lot, and I was rather confused by it for a while. My interpretation was always what I just mentioned. Chara didn't understand the purpose behind replaying the game and killing everybody when you could just do that somewhere else. It isn't efficient. But the wiki page implies the line is only used to convey that they're unable to feel emotions like sentimentality, which, in my opinion, is a lot less interesting. It actually made me second guess a lot of my original thoughts on this line, so I reached out to my friend Danny to ask what she thought of it. She went on to say, "My assumptions was that on the first general route, Chara thought you hated the world and wanted to see it deleted, which was a goal they agreed with. But going back and doing it a second time meant that couldn't be the case, and you have to have some kind of love or perverted sentimentality, as they call it, and and they were confused by that. I personally love this interpretation, and I think it makes a lot of sense. It reinforces how strange it is in theory to love a game so much that you're willing to kill all of its characters you adore just to experience more of what it has to offer, and how even a self-proclaimed demon is unable to understand such a mentality. It goes to show how detached we as players can become from the impact we have on fictional worlds because of the barrier we're able to put up, considering it is just fiction. In the universe, Chara is unable to understand how a person can love a world and that being the motivation to destroy it. But for us, we know it just means seeing more of what the game has to offer. And that dynamic between the player and character is what I think Chara is meant to represent, pointing out how strange our love for the game can be, what that love makes us do, or really what we choose to do, how it makes us feel, and how the world responds to that. And so when I look at this line, I like to imagine both of these answers to be accurate. They're not only confused with the goal of returning to the world in terms of efficiency, but also with the idea of loving a world so much that you destroy it just to see the outcome. Either way, I think it's incredibly effective. Of course, there are other elements to the character that are mentioned, such as their enjoyment of chocolate, their favorite number being 9, their notable fascination with knives, and the list could go on, but those aren't particularly relevant and, for the most part, just seem to serve as extra flavor for them. If you're really interested in small Chara fun facts, just look at the Wiki page or something. But getting back on topic, I mentioned how Chara relates to the player in terms of telling the game's story. And this is true in terms of us looking inwards in the game, and it looking right back out, being able to understand that there is a player behind it. There is certainly an intentional connection that Toby is trying to point our attention towards. But how else can we push this idea? How much further can it go? How far can Undertale take this meta story element until it begins sinking? Well, truthfully, we're already drowning in it. Writing this little intro after I already finished the script, let me warn you that this section is going to be pretty convoluted and, to be quite frank, messy. I had such a difficult time writing it, and I'm not sure I can flesh it out better to be more concise, so bear with me for a little bit. I'm really trying here. Undertale makes it a point to connect the player to the game by not only writing memorable characters and moments, but also making characters that know of not just your existence, the player's existence, but the impact you can make on the world. This is in the form of Flowey, who used to have control over the timeline before the player showed up. Sans is also aware of resets, though contrary to popular belief, he cannot remember your genocides. And to an extent, Asgore might also be aware, considering his reactions to the number of times he's killed the player. And finally, Chara is the last major character who is outwardly aware of the resets and the player. This can literally be seen in the last moments of the genocide route when we finally have a one-on-one conversation with them. And considering they seem to be the narrator for at least a partial part of the game, it would be understandable to assume they've been aware during the entire time the player's been involved in the world. But that begs an interesting question. You see, in the world of Undertale, whoever has the most amount of determination controls the timeline. Flowey had control before us because Alphys had injected determination into him during her true lab experiments, and humans naturally possessed determination, so it just made sense for us to inherit control over the timeline after we started playing. But that creates a new dilemma. Did Chara ever have control at some point? And if so, why did they lose control? Because sure, it could be easy to conclude that when Chara died, they no longer had control because they were dead. But consider these lines from Flowey's New Home monologue. At any point, I could have let this world continue on without me, but as long as I was determined to live, I could go back. This suggests that someone with enough determination to control the timeline could maintain it as long as they were determined to keep going. The only way somebody else could take it from them is if the controller simply gave up or somebody suddenly gained more determination, i.e. Omega Flowey. And in Chara's case, nobody else gained more determination during their lifetime or after the death. So what happened? Well, let's go back to Chara climbing Mount Ebott to begin with. Asriel claims it was for an unhappy reason, but never elaborates past that. I think there's a decent chance this line may be implying that Chara did it because they felt like they had no other options anymore. In a way, they may have climbed the mountain to take their own life. But that plan was changed when the bed of flowers cushioned their fall. And perhaps despite all the good they may have had through the Dreemurr family, that desire never truly left them. So when they died from their plan with Asriel, they had no wish to keep living on. And that would be why the world continued without them. Effectively, they lose their control over the timeline because they wanted to. Though I suppose you could argue against this by saying how Chara had accidentally tripped into the underground rather than intentionally falling, as their exact plan is left vague. And I mean, I don't really have a good argument against that. It's not specified whether or not this was an accident, and it's unclear whether or not they were even aware of the ability to save or reset. But now I'm going way too deep into the rabbit hole, so I'm just gonna call it off here. But I bring this up because the idea of whoever controls the timeline is the main conflict between the player and Flowey. But now that we're around, who actually controls the timeline? It seems like a pretty basic answer. You'd assume it'd just be us, but there may be more to that question than what you'd initially think. Hear me out for a second. What if Chara controls the timeline when we play? Strange, but there's a really good Reddit post by Fidodo? I'm just gonna go with that. But there's a really good Reddit post by Fidodo about this theory, so I'll summarize some of the main points. The genocide route is a great outlier. No matter what Frisk does later, the consequences remain forever. The only differences from other runs are LV and killing monsters, and none of that is ever implied to affect determination. But that would mean Chara is in control of the timeline in all runs, which, as I have discovered, is supported by quite a few details. Chara literally says as much in the genocide epilogue, but also when they mention how the soul and determination they had were not theirs, but ours. And quoting again from their post, considering NarraChara and the theory that Chara has been attached in some form to Frisk's soul ever since Frisk fell on its grave, it isn't impossible that if Chara was exposed to determination that brought it back to life, it could also use that determination for timeline manipulation purposes, provided Chara had enough of it. The thread goes on to talk about how it connects on a metagame level, but closes it out with one more piece that relates back to true resets. Quote, first of all, Frisk doesn't show memories of true resets. After a true reset, Frisk will no longer turn around to shake Sans' hand before he asks. Second, after a pacifist ending, after we open the game again, we'll be confronted with Flowey, who asks someone he doesn't think is Frisk and whom he calls Chara to not reset. This implies that Frisk is not the wielder of the determination that allows the player to control the timeline. They forget about Sans' handshake spiel. We continue playing the game even after Frisk exits the underground, but we never join them unless you get a true pacifist ending, perhaps because Chara didn't want to reach further unless it was the ending they desired. Really, it's hard to tell. This is pure speculation land at this point, and I'm not willing to fully dedicate myself to this idea, but I do think it's worth mentioning, as Chara's influence that the whole game is left incredibly vague. And unfortunately, as much as I love this game, it's somewhat convoluted and mildly frustrating. So much so that while I was on call with a few of my friends watching the person who edits most of my audio, Bling, finish Undertale, Danny, Jira, and I were once again discussing what role Chara plays in the game. Quote, I always found it really tough to get my head around how the player and Chara are the same and also how they differ. So it would be really good to have that put into words. And yeah, she's right. There are enough parallels between Chara and us to the point where it can't be ignored. But there's more than enough threads for them to be their own person that we can't look past that either. And in my opinion, if you go too far one way, you'll start getting the people who blame Chara for all the actions that they did. And if you go too far the other direction, you're intentionally avoiding parallels that should be noted. But regardless, our conversation continued. I had some thoughts about how the player and Chara relate to each other, and so here's a condensed version of my rant I sent to them. I think the game wants us to believe we're the same person, as in putting our own name for the human, characters who know the player's name referring to them by the player's input and not the person who's playing, etc, etc, etc. In the same way that Frisk was a fake out, I think Chara functions as a second layer of a fake out, somewhat. Their motivations seem to align 20 times more with us, most notably in the genocide route, probably because they don't have a soul anymore. And so the idea of killing everyone who stands in their way as a means to gain power, their reason for reincarnation, may seem pretty appealing. Additionally, it's their way to discover the limits of the world. And as we know, Chara likes to find the limits of things, so they choose to go along with it. In a way, it makes me kind of question how much Chara takes control in not only the genocide route, but the neutral and pacifist route as well. Because really, where does the line blur when Chara takes control in genocide and when it's Frisk? Is it after Toriel? After exhausting the kill count in Ruins? Does Frisk still have it? Why would Frisk go along with that? Does that even matter? What if Frisk never had it to begin with? Does Chara have control the entire time? And if they do, does that mean our actions are technically Chara's? I know I'm treading extreme territory right now, but give me a second. But what about when Chara does their own actions by moving on the genocide route or erasing the world? How does that fit if our actions are meant to be theirs? Well, I like to think back to what Sans said in the Judgment Hall. Love 2 is an acronym. It stands for level of violence, a way of measuring someone's capacity to hurt. The more you kill, the easier it becomes to distance yourself. A line that obviously meant to be taken in the context of fading emotional investment, but what if that line was also taken literally? What if by killing monsters and raising your level of violence, in the context of the genocide route, it's detaching Chara from you? It's you distancing yourself from Chara, or in better terms, it's your actions being distanced from Chara. They're your actions, not theirs, because you distance yourself from them. They go along with it and help, sure, but they didn't make you do any of that. But by the end of the genocide route, they have total control over the world. They can erase it at any moment, with or without your permission. And as stated earlier, LV is never implied to affect determination, so how did Chara suddenly gain control? Well, if Fedoto's post is right, they had it the entire time. But if my rant is to conclude anything, it theorizes that Chara and the player are one and the same until the genocide route. They are their own original character with their own backstory, gender, relationships, fears, motivations, etc., but we take control of them later, specifically when we fall on the bed of golden flowers, where they were buried. This led to their reincarnation. So Chara, otherwise known as us, had control over the timeline. However, as we gain more LV, we distance ourselves from them, enough for them to be completely severed. But that doesn't have to mean the amount of control has to be severed. My conclusion? Chara gains control over the game itself. We keep control over the files. It's why we're able to tamper with them as we see fit. Obviously, the game can't stop us from that, but we generally can't stop the game from performing actions that were baked into the code. I mean, unless you're a modder, but you can't patch every meta-narrative hole. Still confused? I kinda am too. Chara is an incredibly difficult character to talk about in this regard thanks to their ambiguity, and quite frankly, I'm still not 100% sold on this idea. But I think a part of that is out of fear, since this fandom can be very rabid about theories that may or may not be out there. But if I can make it any simpler for you, there's another Reddit post I found after I wrote this by a now deleted user that pretty much covers this exact idea. So I'll read a few excerpts from that, and for the record, any post or video I mention this will be linked in the description. It has been the Undertale fandom's common belief for the past 10 years that the dynamic between Frisk, Chara, and the player looks like this. I'm here to argue it looks more like this. It goes on to talk about some of Flowey's dialogue and how it may work differently with this theory in mind. You can read that on your own, it's very fascinating. But it also states, quote, I'm here to propose that Chara is intended to be synonymous to and an in-universe analog of the player, up until the genocide route breaks the fourth wall and solidifies a deviation between them and us. Chara is the player's true avatar. This does not mean in context that Chara lacks a personality or backstory of their own, but rather they are similar to a typical RPG protagonist, somebody who acts entirely based on the player's will and exists to be projected upon. What I'm trying to say is that we are Chara and Chara is us. It is not until the genocide route in which a distinction is created. Again, there is evidence posted in the post, a good bit that I have already talked about, and funny enough, my whole Sans LV idea was actually mentioned in the comments as well, albeit with a different conclusion, but I still think that's interesting. Again, I'm not trying to say that everything we did was all Chara and the person who cut Spamfin strings was Chara. I'm just pointing out the connections between them and us, and how that aligns with some of the core philosophies of Undertale, like how it deconstructs what it means to be a self-insert and a character within the story. Of course, this idea is just speculation based on the information we're given, and I have no problem with it being wrong. I place it here though because I think it sheds a lot of light on the dynamic between the player and Chara, and that's the entire point of this section. If you disagree with the conclusions I made, perfectly fine. And really, I'm not even fully convinced of them, but I just hope it makes you think more about the dynamic between them and us. It's fascinating and deserves more attention. But with that being said, let's pivot our focus to a theory much more widely discussed and seemingly agreed upon. I want to talk about NarraChara. I originally also included a brief mention of the symbolism of knives in the story, as there were some interesting footnotes to discuss regarding Chara. I wanted to shed a little light on them, but there's an entire video by Shadow of Rozoid on that very topic that does a very good job analyzing that idea. It's a great watch, I highly suggest it. But for now, let's quickly touch on NarraChara. This theory states that in Undertale, Chara is the narrator for pretty much the entire game, including all three main routes, pacifist, genocide, and neutral. Following suit of the other topics, there is a really good thread online by Peppermint Bee that explains this theory in full, but to summarize some of the evidence, the red text in the genocide route is obviously meant to be Chara. I think we can all agree on that, but even some of the white text on that route seem to indicate some personality that is beyond just basic flavor text, or the mirror in Toriel's house changes depending on whether or not you're in a genocide route or after you've completed the True Pacifist route. But then there's some more dubious stuff, such as Chara's bed, stating that if you lie down on it, you might never get up. Ironic considering they died there. Then we could go on about Washua's jokes, the strange implications from those and how they're so specific that only Chara could know about the potential meaning behind them, the game over memories, etc, etc. Again, whole post if you want the full details. But in general, this is the theory. Of course, it's not foolproof. There are holes that you can poke in it since Undertale isn't fully consistent with its logic of narration, though I don't think it was necessarily trying to be. In my personal opinion, I don't fully buy the idea that Chara is the narrator for the majority of the game. However, I could see the red text and dialogue without parentheses being Chara, as there are notable differences between flavor text describing things versus lines that feel a whole lot more personal. And you can see that with the parentheses. Regardless, it's hard to get a full picture of it without going through a book's worth of Reddit threads deconstructing arguments, but this theory is used quite a lot when discussing some of the meta aspects of Chara, at least the genocide narration at the bare minimum. And if they are the narrator, it could have some interesting implications for Chara's personality outside of what we know about them from the genocide route, Asriel, or the VHS tapes. Look at Snowdrake's mother, Moldsmall's axe or check info, some of Temmie's flavor text. All of these have a level of humor to them for somebody that's generally supposed to be pretty cut and dry. And in a way, with this theory in mind, it gets hard to tell what is info we can use to gauge Chara's sense of humor or opinions, or what was just Toby dicking around when coding the game. And that's kind of representative of the problem with Chara. They're so shrouded in mystery and vagueness that my interpretation of them could be vastly different from another person's. What I think may be crucial info to understanding who they are, another person might find to be service level. But to try to avoid that being an issue going forward as much as possible, I think it might be fair to give a recap of the canon story we're given about Chara. That way, when we're looking at the moral implications of it, we have all the facts on the table. So humor me for a second. Chara fell down into the underground around 2001X. The exact events that led up to their climb of Mount Ebott are unknown, but something probably happened that resulted in them growing an extreme grudge against humanity, and as a result, they fled. What would have been a fatal flaw was cushioned by a bed of golden flowers at the bottom of the chasm, in which Azrael, the son of King Asgore Dreemurr and Queen Toriel Dreemurr, had helped them up. Later, they would be adopted by the royal family and grow connections with them. Based on their vocabulary, it's implied that they spent more time around Toriel or generally had a stronger bond with her in comparison to Asgore. They had become best friends with Azrael and filled the entire underground with hope. At some point, Chara had learned of the prophecy. They would begin making plans to go through with it in some form, but the order of events is a bit unclear. Chara and Azrael would start filming with a camera, videos of their creepy face discussing how they accidentally got Asgore sick when adding buttercups to a pie they were making, and the preparation for Chara's plan. During some of these recordings, they would downplay Azrael's concerns or straight up insult him for crying. The nature of their friendship is shown to be very positive on the outside, but when looking inward, these cracks began forming. Eventually, Chara would fall sick after consuming a pie with buttercups that the two had made. Their dying wish was to see the flowers of their village, but it was a request that couldn't have been made considering, barrier. After they died, Azrael absorbed their soul and went to lay their body to rest at the human village. The humans had attacked them. Chara wanted to use the full strength of Azrael to wipe them all out, whilst Azrael had restrained. When they returned back to the underground, he perished from the attacks, leaving both of the royal family's children dead. Asgore had initially placed Chara in a coffin in the basement of the castle, but once he declared war on humanity, Toriel became disgusted with his actions and took Chara's body back to the ruins for a proper burial. Many years later, Frisk would fall into the underground, leading to Chara's reincarnation. And really, the rest is up to you. Do you spare all the monsters and eventually lead them to the surface, which would ultimately fulfill Chara's wishes to begin with? Or do you kill every monster that you physically can, feeding Chara's need to see the limits of everything, which ultimately leads to the soulless version of them erasing the world? It's your choice, which is a part of why I'm leaning towards the idea that Chara is more so meant to be a partial stand-in for the player. They have a backstory, personality, relations, motivations, flaws, strengths, all that, but they're meant to share your name. They're the character who other characters like Flowey referred to even during the epilogue when he's trying to reach out to you, the player. They're connected to you throughout the game, but as you gain more love, you distance yourself away from them, which I think is also meant to represent you distancing yourself emotionally from the game itself. Chara is the game you, and if you distance yourself from the game, you're distancing yourself away from the avatar that's meant to portray you. And you can do that even further if you persist with the genocide route, so much so that the intended endgame personification of you is so confused with your actions and perverted sentimentality that they can't even understand it anymore. That's fucked. When a demon thinks you're beyond their understanding, maybe it's time for you to reconsider your actions. Hell, the game states that Chara wasn't that great of a person, and if they're us and we do the genocide route, can you really disagree with the game's assessment? Going off script, but I would also like to note that I think it's very interesting that after, Frisk is revealed to be Frisk, any choices that you make later past that point no longer affects the actual outcome. To hug Azrael or to be the ambassador or not doesn't really change anything outside of, a few small details, but at the end of the day, Flowey's still going to come up and he's still going to tell you about true resets, which to me kind of reinforces that idea that Chara and us are meant to be more similar in the fact of how we impact the world. When Chara is still shown to be us, who is meant to be our name, our actions have impact. But when it's not, our impact is pretty much gone. In a way, we're disconnected from this character that we've controlled, so we no longer have control over, the outcome. In the same way that by the end of Genocide, whenever we're fully disconnected from this character, we no longer have control over the outcome. I don't know, I just think that's kind of interesting, just a little thought. And for the record, I am not saying that doing the Genocide route makes you a bad person by proxy. You paid for the game, you should be allowed to play it however you want. Plus, again, it is just fiction at the end of the day. However, from the perspective of the game, this is the only world they know, so of course they would consider you a bad person for taking such a route like that. They're under the impression that their world is real. And I mean, if somebody mass murdered an entire group of people just for the hell of it, I'm sure everyone would, or should, agree that is objectively bad. There is no fiction to hide behind there, much like the world that these characters coincide. This is their reality, and they all, most of them all, treat it as such. And since we're on the topic of moral implications when regarding actions, I think we can finally move on to the actual topic of the video title. Yes, 25 minutes, and yet I haven't even touched upon the actual title of the video. I wasn't lying when I said this was less about the title and more an overall character analysis and info dump. Sorry. So, to finally answer the question I posed in the title of the video, was Chara Dreemurr a bad person? In short, I don't think so. Kinda. But as Azrael stated, they probably weren't a great person either. I know, it's a cop-out to just reiterate the exact quote in the game after all this, but I'm more interested in dissecting why they weren't completely evil. Because just saying, they weren't amazing but not horrible is kinda boring on its own. So let's finish this off with a bang, shall we? Here is my take. I do not think Chara was a bad person. Yes, it is implied and outright stated that they probably weren't that great of an individual, but there seems to be a lot of nuance to that idea. Consider their motivations for running away to Mount Ebit. Azrael claims it was for an unhappy reason, along with how they treated him during their friendship. Of course, it's shown to be somewhat toxic within the VHS tapes, and that's probably a big understatement, but we're looking at the relationship of two children. Things should not be expected to be all sunshine and rainbows with 100% healthy dynamics. They're like 10. Additionally, according to Asgore, Chara's eyes had evoked a feeling of hope, which really intrigues me that he could read that considering Chara is implied to spend more time with Toriel, as they take on their dialect while Azrael takes on Asgore's. And that isn't even considering their plan at the end of their life. It's left rather vague as to their motives, but there's two interpretations that can be considered most likely. Chara is explicitly stated to have hated humanity. At the same time, they wanted monsters to be free and had learned of the Deltarune prophecy and the angel. Not long after that, they wanted to poison themselves with buttercups, which, if you remember, is the same flower that they had used when accidentally poisoning Asgore. I will bring this back up later. Regardless, they used the buttercups to die so Azrael could absorb their soul and bring their body up to the surface to see the flowers of their village. Azrael was then attacked by the humans who believed he had killed a child, but he refrained from fighting back. Interestingly enough, he confirms in his final monologue that Chara had slight control of his body because their soul was absorbed, and was attempting to gain control to kill the humans. But Azrael stood his ground and didn't allow for it. This leaves the dilemma. Did Chara make the plan to kill humans or to save monster kind? Or perhaps maybe even a mix of both? Personally, I think a mix of both motivations make the most sense. They're implied to have somewhat of a difficulty connecting with others. When they and Azrael accidentally poisoned Asgore, Chara laughed it off and wasn't nearly as worried as Azrael was. They would call Azrael a crybaby, but they are confirmed to have hated humans. It would be logical to assume they're spiteful and wanted to kill them, but they're also confirmed to have still cared about their family. They wouldn't have attempted to make the butterscotch pie for Asgore if that wasn't the case, nor been around Toriel so much to pick up on their vocabulary habits. Their heart locket also symbolizes their friendship with Azrael too. too. That's one of their defining characteristics. So it would also be logical to assume they wanted to free the monsters as well. I think it's a case of great writing where you can pick one or the other and see them as a saint or a villain, or you can choose both and see them as a three-dimensional flawed character. However, what about the genocide route? They're pretty clearly portrayed as a villain in there, right? They literally erase the world and believe the monsters are nothing more than experience points. This is valid for this argument, but consider one thing. They're bargained at the end of the genocide run. If you erase the world, return, and intend to bring the game back, they criticize the player for feeling like they're above consequences. However, they will choose to bring the world back if the player gives them their soul. This obviously states in bold text that they currently do not possess a soul. They were reincarnated without one, and are effectively the same as Flowey. They're both even portrayed to have the same stereotypical motivations for basic villains, doing things to get stronger or just to see what would happen. It's an incredibly fitting context too, considering they're siblings. The same fate for both of them would make sense, thematically I'd say, but Flowey confirms in the same run that because he was reborn without a soul, he doesn't feel emotion anymore. He has no remorse or feeling, and therefore felt no guilt for murder. Would it also not make sense to apply the same result to Chara? They're forced against their will to be soulless, but have the power to break the world when given the determination to do so. But again, that's who they are when they do not have a soul, considering how they were when they were actually alive, and motivations, age, environment, personality, and any other inferences that could be made from the VHS tapes, Azrael's monologues, Flowey's monologues, etc. I really don't think they were a horrible person. Great? Probably not. But assuming a character is bad just because they weren't perfect is clearly not how Toby intends his stories to go. Considering the only character that is outright evil in any of his writing is King from Deltarune, but even he is shown via his own dialogue to care about his son and wife deeply, so he's not completely irredeemable, and I think writing Chara off as an unforgivable basic villain is ignoring a lot of the context that Undertale sets up. Just because it's easier to do so doesn't make it correct. Of course, I think it is undeniable that Azrael had some lasting effects based on the actions or words by Chara. He downplays his own feelings as a result of things they told him. He grows an unhealthy attachment to them that goes as far as resetting the entire world just to play with them more. So much so that it feels like an obsession. That's not even to mention how Chara had attempted to force Azrael to take the lives of multiple humans. They never even considered the extreme mental burden that would place onto him. Obviously, several instances in Azrael's personality seems to align quite a lot with that of abuse victims, such as his devotion to Chara and their plan, denial of his own feelings, rationalization, and more. But we don't necessarily have the full context of how their relationship truly unfolded. We have what we have, and we're given the options to make conclusions based on that. But again, I think I should reiterate that these are children, very young children. The results are undeniable, but it's hard for me to fully get on board with the idea that 2001X Chara was evil, rather than a kid with good intentions who went about it in a terrible way. They wanted to free monsters, that was their big picture goal, but as a result of looking so far in the wider scope for results, they ignored the smaller details that may have harmed those they cared about. And let me reiterate that I am not considering the genocide route in terms of this analysis. The difference between Chara with a soul and soulless Chara seems to be pretty stark. And obviously, they without a soul turned out to be horrible and evil. Not having compassion will do that to you, but I don't think they were always like that, which is the point I'm trying to get across. Chara was not a good person, but I don't believe they were inherently a bad person. Really, they just weren't all that great. They can be criticized for their mistakes, but it hurts me when I see things like Undertale Red and Yellow's interpretation of Chara get hated on for not being worse or truly evil. Like, it's not based fully on canon, but it's close to that, and I wish people acknowledged the nuance of them more. Because as I've stated in my previous videos, what makes a character truly special is one thing: depth. And I wholeheartedly believe Chara has a lot of depth, not only in just how they hold up in terms of morality, but also how they contribute to the overall themes of the game. They're so jam-packed full of thematic implications that it's a theorist's dream to analyze their character. Or a nightmare in my case, considering how difficult it actually was to write this. There is just so many directions you can take with them, and you never know which one the fandom is going to connect with or have pushback on. And that's the beauty of Chara. Much like the absurd amount of options you get in Undertale, or choosing the route you want to take, or even as little as choosing whether or not you want to boot up the game, you also get to decide exactly how you view Chara. You get to decide their fate. And That's it. I hope I answered the questions sufficiently and gave all you Chara fans lots of content to gnaw on. There was a decent amount to go over, and a good chunk of that was just laying out events that happen in-game, but you get the point. Chara is my favorite character in Undertale, and I felt like they deserved a spotlight that I don't see given to them very often. There's a lot to talk about the Skeleton Brothers, or Gaster, or the cast of Deltarune, but have we forgotten one of the most mysterious characters Toby Fox has ever written? Obviously, there are other contenders, but I think it's nice to take a step back to an actual non-Easter egg character within Undertale and come to understand how they contribute to the game as a whole. It's my own personal little love letter to such a cool character. And with that being said, thank you all so much for watching. This video took longer than I expected to make just considering how hard it is to write about Chara, but I'm pretty satisfied with how it turns out. From here on out, I will be shifting my focus back to Hazbin Hotel to finish my review. Expect that to be probably the next video or close to it. It's just such a big project that I had to squeeze something in between while I chip away at that script slowly. But I promise it's getting done. So I think that's all that's left to be said. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this entire thing. It really means a lot to me. But regardless, bye bye for now.